What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown, and this is Heresy Financial. One of the first things that people learn about the Federal Reserve is that it is independent, or at least that it is supposed to be. Now, the degree to which the Federal Reserve is independent is debated, and the degree to which it should be independent is also highly debated. So in this video, we are going to talk about number one, what does the Federal Reserve's independence really mean? Number two, how it got that way, and number three, what it could mean for the future of central banking in the United States. Ready? Let's dive in. When many people first hear about the Federal Reserve, they assume it's just a part of one of the branches of government, similar to how the Treasury is underneath the executive branch, even though spending is controlled by the legislative branch. One of the first things you'll learn about the Federal Reserve, though, is that it's unique in the fact that it is politically independent. This is partly due to its nature of being a quasi-public, quasi-private institution. Now, we'll get into that part in a moment, but what is meant by political independence? Well, at first glance, you would assume that this means that they make decisions completely independent of the federal government, that their job is economic stability or some other monetary voodoo, regardless of what the central government is doing. That is not entirely accurate. More precisely, the Federal Reserve's independence is referring to partisanship independence. This is so that in the short term, the Federal Reserve cannot influence elections and power swings. But it does not mean that they are independent of the federal government as a whole, because they owe their existence and their course of action to Congress alone. They exist under the authorization and direction of Congress. If Congress decides the Federal Reserve needs to do things differently, they will have to do things differently. Long term, they very much contribute to the growing centralization of the federal government by endlessly funding all spending that is in excess of the capacity of the private sector through the purchase of government bonds. So when you hear the Fed's independence, it doesn't mean that they're not supporting the government. It just means that they're not supporting one party or another. And it makes sense why both parties are okay with this, because ultimately what the Federal Reserve does is supports the growing power of the government, and that's precisely what both parties want. They may want to use that power for different things, but that's what both parties want, just more power in the end. Okay, so how did it get this way? Well, at the beginning, the Federal Reserve did start out as much more of a private entity. It was still established by Congress through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, though. Now, over the years, that has changed little by little, catalyzed by one crisis or another, and they've become more and more part of the government since the beginning. And one of the biggest and most recent changes was when the Federal Reserve Act was amended by Congress in 1977. And this is when the Federal Reserve was given its dual mandate that we've all heard so much about. We've all heard Powell get on TV and talk about the dual mandate given to it by Congress, where they have to seek maximum employment and price stability. The funny thing is, the Federal Reserve can't actually do anything about employment, and the way they define stable prices is by endlessly upwardly changing prices. But in any case, like I said earlier, every action the Federal Reserve takes is under the direction of Congress. Even the profits that the Federal Reserve makes, they do not keep. Those profits belong to the government. Now, you might be asking, what profits did the Federal Reserve make? Well, remember that $8 trillion balance sheet that they've accumulated over the years? Their balance sheet, it's essentially just a large account that is full of $8 trillion worth of assets. These are assets like mortgage-backed securities and United States Treasuries, which pay interest. That means they have an account worth $8 trillion of interest-bearing assets. And in borrowing a term from Nassim Taleb, after the Federal Reserve pays its thousands of intellectual yet idiot PhDs their very lofty salaries, which are completely isolated from the business cycle that they've created, they always have tons of money left over. And where does that money go? It is all swept into an account at the Treasury. And yes, just in case you haven't put two and two together yet, that means that all of the interest that the federal government owes on its debt that is owned, any of that debt that's owned by the Federal Reserve, all those interest payments, almost all of it, comes right back to the government, which means all of the debt that is owned by the Federal Reserve is essentially interest-free loans for the government, because they're making these interest payments to the Federal Reserve, and almost all of it gets swept right back. So the more of the national debt that the Federal Reserve buys, the lighter the debt service load gets for the federal government. So what does all this mean for the future of the Federal Reserve? Well, anyone with their eyes tuned to history can see that the Federal Reserve has slowly morphed over time into essentially just a money printer, a source of funding for the federal government. And inevitably, Anytime throughout history, any culture, any country, whenever monetary expansion or really monetary debasement becomes the main source of funding for the government, the currency eventually collapses. When this happens, not if, but when this happens, the Federal Reserve, my bet, will be dissolved or absorbed underneath the Treasury. The current dollar, which are Federal Reserve notes, will be completely replaced by a new dollar, likely something called the Treasury dollar, like we had during the Civil War. It was money issued directly by the Treasury, and it could very easily coincide with the release, the rollout, or the final push of the CBDC by the United States government, central bank digital currency, like what people are calling a Fed coin now. Now, on one hand, this could potentially be a good move because it puts the power of the printing press into more of a position of accountability to voters, whereas it really doesn't have that right now because everybody running the Federal Reserve, they're not elected officials. So it puts more accountability from voters on the people who are in charge of monetary policy. But on the other hand, those who are in charge of fiscal policy right now have always had direct accountability to voters, and look how far that's gotten us. So in summary, the Federal Reserve is independent from partisanship. However, they operate only because Congress said they could, and they only do what Congress says they should. And at the next large monetary crisis, which will likely be the collapse of the dollar, the Federal Reserve will likely be fully absorbed by the Treasury and will have zero independence left. I hope this clarifies things and helps you out, and as always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.